that's okay. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Celine. Celine's going to be facilitating the panel discussion, and I'll let her introduce herself and also give the opportunity for the panelists to introduce themselves.
Hi, thank you for having us. I think that we'll learn a lot from the panels, and I'm so excited to hear their knowledge. Just to introduce myself, I'm Celine Debassige. My pronouns are she, her. I'm Ojibwe and Dene. Both of my parents are residential school and day school survivors. And I have been I grew up in Ottawa and try my best to play an active role within the community as best as I can, considering that I've had a lot of privilege in the fact that I got to be raised within the community and had access to cultural and traditional practices that a lot of Indigenous youth and throughout our timeline has not been granted so easily. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And yeah, I've been living on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin territory since I was 6. But my mom is from Chaging Island, Chaging First Nations on Manitoulin Island, and my father is Dene within the Prince George, BC area. So yeah, that's my introduction, and I'm so happy to introduce the panelists that we have. So we'll start with Nikki Fraser. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
So, like Hafaitit, Nikki Fraser in Squest to Kamloops Stachlin. Hi, everybody. My name is Nikki, and I am from Kamloops to Secwepemc, which is within the Secwepemc Ulu, a part of the Secwepemc Nation here in the interior of BC. And my dad is from Treaty 1 territory, Sandy Bay, Manitoba. So I'm both Secwepemc and Anishinaabe. And I'm just so honored to be a part of conversations like this. I think it's important to have different perspectives and different ways of looking at wellness. And I think it's something that's been really close to my heart over this last 6 years. And it's a part of my own healing journey, my own self-love journey, my own journey in life is to learn our ways as Indigenous people and how we had our own wellness. And it's been really good so far. And so I'm just grateful to be able to have a conversation like this and learn from everybody else. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks so much for coming out. I know the time difference can be challenging to navigate sometimes with everything being online. It's weird times, but thank you so much for coming out, and I can't wait to learn from you. And the next panelist we have, who is literally such an icon and one of my biggest role models, I'd like to introduce Gabby, Gabrielle Fayant, if you'd like to speak.
Cool. Thanks, Celine. So ani bojo tanchakiwa wa mishendenkwe ankwat kwendeshnakas sa pakjahan sandon jaba o mamawene ne neshnabe kindonji makwando dam nesame dana ashenij nedesobe bonwe machifin dao otipamesa waken dao A7G and Dono Key. So hey everyone, my name is Gabrielle Fayant. Most people know me as Gabby, as Celine mentioned. I'm originally from Alberta. My family comes from one of the 8 land-based Métis settlements called Fishing Lake, or also known as Pakchahanse or Sputnau. I'm pretty far from my homelands, and that's just a part of our realities as Indigenous peoples trying to survive colonization. We just get separated from our homelands quite often. But I'm actually on a road trip right now. So today's like our first day of our road trip. So we made it to Espanola. So I'm actually pretty close to Celine's community. I'm like an hour away from Manitoulin Island. So I'll put some tobacco down for you. And what else did I say? Yeah, like I mentioned, I live in Ottawa, traditional Algonquin territory, unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory. And I'm a helper and co-founder with Assembly of Seven Generations, and so we're a youth-led, an Indigenous youth-led nonprofit organization located in Ottawa as well. Yeah, and we do like all kinds of cool things, and I'll probably talk about some of the things that we do as we get going. But yeah, health and wellness to me is it's not something I really like categorize or silo into a specific box, but it's a part of everything I do. And I think that for many of us, that's how we also see health and wellness. It's included in language, it's included in community, it's included with arts and culture and economies, and it's all a part of how we live. And so, yeah, we can talk about that a little bit too. Just how like Western society likes to silo everything into separate boxes, but really it's all intertwined. So Miigwech Chai Hai, looking forward to having these conversations with you all.
Yeah, that's I'm so happy to be here. Um, there's there's a lot of labels that Western society likes to put on to things, and I think that's partially to make it easier to continue these forms of oppression. It's easier to categorize on who goes what into to what system, and it's easier to gatekeep a lot of things from those um, minorities that are facing those oppression, those oppressive systems. And as we continue this conversation, I'm sure that we'll definitely unpack with the how intermingled everything is. Um, so I'm really happy to be here, you guys. This is bear with me. This is like my first time moderating a panel, so hope we're just gonna take it easy. At the end of the day, people are people are people. So if I tend to mess up on my wording or get a little stage fright, apologies in advance. Um, but it's really nice to be given the opportunity to have these conversations, especially with such strong Indigenous women like yourselves. Um, and I think it's definitely important to have this type of representation um, being so easily accessible. Thank you for Women of Color Remaking Wellness to be using that platform to gain more clarity for people and transparency for what really matters. Um, so we'll get into the panel discussions, and we briefly talked about how health and what health and wellness meant to you, and but let's dive deeper into the ways the industry specifically fails Indigenous women and Indigenous like in women of color, and I know that just a trigger warning in advance for any watchers that these are some really tough and hard conversations to be having and to unpacking, especially if it's something that um, you've been trying to navigate as an individual. So it's a safe space, and if there are moments where you feel the need to take a step back, catch your breath, figure out how to be zen, do what you've got to do. And at the end of the day, healing isn't linear, but it's something that comes when it's meant to. So yeah, I'll pass it on to maybe does anyone want to go first for how the industry fails us? Because I'll pick drum roll. I'll go Nikki.
I was just unmuted my mic. So
Nice.
That's a very, very heavy question or topic on how it fails us, and it's sad that it's still a reality today that wellness is looked at as more of a privilege and not a human right, especially when it comes to our women, our Indigenous women of color. Like most of the time, our own people are struggling even to have healthy food on the table, let alone being able to have the money to go and participate in wellness programs that are enormously expensive, and they're profiting off of people's hurt, people's pain, people's trauma. And you know, it's sad to see that the people who really would benefit from participating in programs, participating in wellness activities don't really have that opportunity to. So I always think about when I'm sitting in the room, who is not here and who needs to be here. That's the first thing I think about. So when I'm sitting in a conversation like this, I'm not thinking about my own wellness journey. I'm just like, what would the people who don't have the access to have conversations about re-indigenizing wellness, or even having the opportunity to participate in wellness, is who I think about when I'm doing any kind of conversations like that. It could be about wellness, it could be about language, it could be about Indigenous food sovereignty. I'm like, who are the people that aren't here that need to be here, and what would they need me to say? And not that I'm taking anybody's voice away, I'm always saying there's more voices that need to be a part of these kinds of conversations, and those are the voices that we need to hear from, and those are the people, the women, the lives that we really need to think of when we talk about how it's failing our women in general. Because when I look at it, I'm like, oh, you know, I look at my own privilege on being able to go to the gym, you know, and have that physical wellness. The privilege to be able to live in community and be on the land and go up the mountain. Like, that's a privilege to me. And I think about the youth and other women who are in urban areas that don't have those access. So there's definitely a gap in between wellness groups, wellness activities, and the people that need to access it. And there needs to be some kind of connections on how we can get those services to the people that need it the most and who would benefit from the most. So that's where I see the need when we talk about how the industry fails our women.
And that was an amazing answer to that question. I know it's a definitely loaded question for sure. And there you raise a good point on including more voices to the table. And I think when in terms of decolonizing and re-indigenizing these spaces, I often think about how within the teachings that I've been I received growing up, is that everyone has everyone's valid, no matter what path in life. And that when we put value onto people's inherent rights, that's such a colonial mindset. So ensuring that every voice and person's needs are being met within that table, that's where true attainable change and care comes from. Um, Now, Gabby, would you like to answer how you see the industry failing Indigenous women and women of color?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much, Nikki, for talking about like accessibility and even how there's so much ableism within the health and wellness industry. It's just the reality is that not everyone can just go to a gym, and get on a treadmill and go to Whole Foods and get those kind of organic and you know, nicely made foods. It's just not possible for everyone. And so I really believe that if it's not accessible for those that need it the most, then we need to do a lot better. And so there's also like a lot of parts of like healing and wellness that I think are really should be foundational parts of healing and wellness. And so healing and wellness looks so different for everyone. Sorry, health and wellness. It looks so different for everyone. It's not like a cookie cutter type of thing. It's not like we can all be in this one little box. And so self determination and self autonomy is really, really important, I believe. And I'm really a strong advocate for harm reduction and folks being able to make informed decisions about their lives, their bodies, and their health and their well being. And I don't see that really within the health and wellness industry, and it is an industry. We can't forget that it is a product that of capitalism and it's working under a capitalistic model. And kind of like Nikki, you were talking about it too, about how it's really benefiting off of people's pain and hurt. And I don't think that that's how our our ancestors would have modeled their lives. We wouldn't just get to a point where we're sick and then try to find a solution. We would be doing things in a proactive way, and health and well being would have been a part of everything that we do. And it still is for many of us. But I always remember one of my elders talks about how um, before colonization, a lot of our people used to live into their hundreds, and so we were healthy, healthy people in comparison to Europeans. In that era, Europeans were dying at 30 years old. So when Europeans arrived here, they had a lot of diseases, and those diseases were then transmitted to us. And I believe that's really the biggest impact of health and wellness on Indigenous people. That was like the start of this really downward spiral that we're now in. And now, white European folks live longer than Indigenous people in their homelands. And that's really messed up. Some of the like specific like industry things, like the list, you could make tons of lists, but some of the things that like come to my mind first are like the body mass index, or like BMI. I think that's so problematic. The BMI is literally created by white folks for white folks. Our bodies do not look the same. Our bodies don't work the same. Indigenous people's bodies have adapted and survived on these lands for thousands of years. Our bodies aren't made to live in Europe, where these concepts are centered for. Another big one I think about often, and one of the youth I work with told me this story, and I always think about it, but it's about like dental care, which is a part of health and wellness. And so a lot of times when we go to the dentist will say that we need to like shave down our teeth, that our teeth are crooked and things like that, and they'll change our teeth. But our teeth are actually made to like rip off dry meat and like eat seal and all these kind of things that vegans will tell you is not very healthy. But that's what our teeth are for. Even a lot of us have like scoop teeth, so like there's like that space in the back, and so that's our anatomy of eating meat for thousands of years and living and working with the animals, not in a consumption way, but more as a way of living together with the land. So those are like the two big things that came to my mind first. And of course, we always got to talk about toxic positivity. I find a lot of like health and wellness, it's like, if I could do it, you could do it. Or you need to lose weight, or you need to look like this, you need to do squats. And like, it's more about looking a certain way instead of actually being healthy. Um, but I can tell you that I know a lot of folks that will go to the gym, but when I bring them out to the land, they only last for like half an hour. And I don't go to the gym, but I could last all day outside. So, we have to come back to our original ways, and we might not look like those beauty standards, but we're really healthy when we're out on the land and working with the animals and the plants and the water. So yeah, those are some of my thoughts for now.
Chimiwich, these are great points to be bringing up. When there's so many points that were made, and I want to sort of take a moment to reflect on how, Gabby, you shared about how these systems are made in a capitalistic system. Like it is an industry, and people are benefiting from other people's pain, like Nikki said. When I think about the industry, and I was just having a conversation about this with my best friend, um, and I think about how in the system of Canada, we think of free healthcare and these progressive policies, but that's not actually what we have, in terms of the reality that this form of government gives to its citizens, especially with the relationship between Indigenous people and the government. Like the Indian Act is still in place, so that in itself is how the industry is failing, because there are forms of racist and inherently oppressive policies and legislations that are continuously being put to action. And I think about how, so like I went into school for social work originally, and I think health and wellness ties into everything. We're taught about the medicine wheel and how each direction covers an aspect of your own health and wellness, including your mental health. So the fact that, like there's so many examples of industry failing Indigenous, um, women and women of color, just Indigenous people and people of color in general, where, we get into these systems of inherently like colonial coping mechanisms. Like when I think of mental health, I think of how oftentimes it's because of these historical hardships that the government has placed on Indigenous people have created such a form of toxic coping mechanisms that become normalized and that stigmatize us, and especially in terms of um, substance abuse, and that harm reduction is so stigmatized, um, and not to mention the amount of suicide rates that we have within our communities, where pre-colonial times, like Gabby said, we were living a good, healthy life. And there's just it's a continued list of points of failure within these systems. I really think about Jordan's principle so often in terms of how Indigenous youth, these children, are often, sorry, I'll move so my friend isn't in the way. But we where we where our children, one, were being taken away from our communities, but also when taken away, not given the proper access or proper healthcare that they deserved. There's the whole child welfare system in itself is a continued form of oppressive oppressiveness, because it's within Indigenous youth where we see that uprising, and we see that resurgence, and it's because we grow within our youth into our adult selves where we can make those healthy paths for the next 7 generations. Um, so there's so many ways of industries failing, and on top of the failing youth, but failing our mothers, our matriarch, and how forced sterilization is still a thing, and how children's aid services are often called right away when an Indigenous woman gives birth. So there's a lot that there needs to be unpacked, especially within spirituality, like Gabby was pointing out, to that positivity, like modern age spirituality, like this new wave of wokeness, I guess, is often termed like it is cultural appropriation in terms of like these people that aren't people of color are often taking away from those generational um, points of wisdom, and taking only little bits and pieces of those lessons to give them some sort of self-reassurance to whatever their needs are. So with that, leading into representation, and how are you guys feeling about representation within health and wellness? I know that for myself, it's hard to pinpoint where I feel safe and comfortable accessing points of health services, being Indigenous. So I wonder, like, what are your views on how representation plays a huge factor within this topic? So I'll change it up and go over to Gabby first.
Cool, for sure. Um, yeah, it's a tricky space because I do believe that representation matters. However, I don't think we should stop at representation. And that's kind of like what happens is that, folks are like, we have representation now and we can see ourselves in these places, but that's where it stops. And for me, that's a big problem. I've seen healthcare centers operate as if they're, a hospital. kind of like branding themselves as Indigenous and having Indigenous staff and, you know, putting like almost like symbolism around their space and claiming to be Indigenous spaces. But when you walk in the door, you know, they treat you even worse than some hospitals treat you. So for me, like, representation isn't enough. We need to go way beyond that. And for me, it's about like, we need to see big systemic changes, structural changes, and I'm often for like dismantling everything. So that's kind of where I'm at. But I'll pass it over to Nikki.
Thank you for talking about not plateauing at representation. It's really good to finally see, you know, Indigenous women being celebrated, women of color being celebrated in modern, you know, mainstream media when it comes to, you know, our uniqueness and our own standards of beauty when it comes to whether we're Indigenous or women of color. It's nice to be able to see that, but Gab's right. You can't just stop there, because I think that's even causing more damage, because you see yourself, but then you don't really get to feel that reward or feel that welcome in that circle. You just see yourself there and you're like, okay, now what? So you can't stop there. And I'm about dismantling as well too. I'm like, I'm for the people. Like, we need the, you know, rewrite it, people led, grassroots led. I'm all about that. Representation, I'm a huge advocate for representation, and especially when it comes to Indigenous people. I feel like Indigenous people are like grouped into like this one big lump sum, and that we're so diverse. Like in BC, we have like 34 different Indigenous languages in our province alone, in our one little province alone. Compared to Canada, there's probably like 100 and something different Indigenous languages, and there's 3 different Indigenous groups. And, you know, if you come to BC, I could drive an hour one way, and I'm in a whole different territory, a whole different language barrier, a whole different culture. So when we have representation, we have to recognize that these different nations within our nation have different wellness practices, different ways of wellness. And when we talk about wellness, and Gab mentioned this before, that it's personal, it's so intimate. Like, wellness for me is like very personal, it's very intimate. It has a lot to do with ceremony, it has a lot to do with cultural practices and teachings, and being out on the land and being with my people and being with my community. Like, that's like very personal to me. But if you ask my mom, it's probably something completely different. Or my grandma, it probably looks really different for her too. So yeah, I feel like more representation is needed at all levels, just not the front cover, but at all levels when it comes to wellness. Just not, oh, we have the token position here, we have an Indigenous voice. Great, you have an Indigenous voice at one table, now add them to all the tables so that we have those important conversations and important input when it comes to, you know, inclusion and equity for health and wellness for not just Indigenous people, but for women everywhere.
Those were some great answers. It definitely provoked a lot of thought for me. I know when we talk about how representation matters, it is pretty surface level, and that's oftentimes where mistakes go often. Like, that's where cycles are formed, because it won't go deeper into these issues. And I'm definitely all about dismantling too. I often think about how so many people, like, within the world that we live in, a lot of these issues that we face can be resolved quite easily, if we were to return to these pre-colonial ways, especially in terms of just, I mean, everything, because everything connects. But thinking about how we're literally on a floating rock in space, and people are worried about the economy, and people are putting, these politicians are, and these governments are putting these white man philosophies before people's needs. And that does not sit with me. And I'm very much so for changing it from foundation up, because that, and maybe even further deeper into the foundation, because I think that there's often things that we as Indigenous people being displaced so often, we have to figure out what our foundation is, and recognizing that within, in terms of allyships, and in terms of inherent gifts and practices and teachings that we can all share with each other, there are moments of like, there's definitely more that could be rooted into healthier ways, now that we understand and can see the intersections between these issues. So in just getting a healthy foundation is something that I think definitely is bigger than just surface level representation, for sure. And we've been talking about decolonizing and indigenizing a lot, and I think that it might be just a good idea to unpack what those two terms mean for you guys as individuals within the work that you guys do. All of it is decolonizing and indigenizing. I often talk about how, like, as like a radical socialist, as my dad calls me, or like this community activist that some people might see me as, I often think about my existence just as an Indigenous woman, and how that in itself is my biggest, that's who I am, and that's my first identifier, instead of a socialist or an activist or anything, because these are my rights that I'm fighting for. These are my friends' rights that I'm fighting for. That shouldn't be like, wanting a healthy and good life for everyone shouldn't be a role that needs to be identified, but a role that is just purely inherent in all of us. Um, so I'm gonna dive deep into what decolonizing means to you guys, because Indigenous existence is resistance on its own, as long as these systems are at play. So, um, Nikki, I'll throw it back to you.
I think that's something I'm still personally trying to figure out myself, is what that really genuinely means to me. I don't claim to know everything, and I am humbly still learning my cultures and my way, and the way my people spoke our language. Like I'm still a learner, and I've been learning my language since I was like 7 years old, and I'm still like a rookie. So like I'm still learning on what that really genuinely means to me. But looking at it, I immediately think of the Indian Act, and how that one piece of legislation, that one document has, like broken so many, like my nations, a lot of nations, a lot of people, a lot of Indigenous nations has broken their way of governing, their way of healing, their way of living in general. And so when I think about decolonization, that's the first thing I look at and think about, is like, how do we get rid of this? How do we move beyond this? How do we not always have to follow that as like a First Nations person in Canada. Like, why do we always have to fall on the Indian Act? And so to me, decolonizing is not doing that, not listening to the Indian Act and moving beyond it. And I feel like a lot of our people, a lot of the younger generation is doing that, but I feel like a lot of our older generation is afraid of that change. That's all they know. And, you know, sometimes like when I wasn't educated or didn't know much about it, the Indian Act, I was like, oh my God, like, why would we like dismantle that? That's the government is committed to us that way, not really knowing what that piece of paper was doing to our people. Now I know, but you know, more of our people need to be I don't want to say educated, but just made aware of what that document truly is meant for and what it was meant to do. It was meant to assimilate us. And when we move, instead of waiting for the government, we just do it ourselves. And I think that's something when I think about decolonizing is not waiting around, we just do it. And I feel like a lot of our people have been doing that. It's like, we're not going to wait for INAC or whoever to tell us, yeah, this is what we can do. Like, we're going to do it. Like, I can just went berry picking for medicine in a provincial park. And I took a bunch of my community members up there and youth. And I remember my mom being like, oh my God, we might get kicked out. And I was like, they can't kick us out. Like, we're picking a berry. Like, what are they going to do with the berries? All these berries are going to fall on the ground. Like, they can't get mad at us about that. We're going to pick it. I'm like, if they try to get mad, I'm going to stay here and keep these berries and keep going. So stuff like that, I think about is decolonizing and just, you know, reclaiming a space that was already ours to begin with and just doing it in a good way, not a resentful way, not being like, that's just not who our people are, is like being hurtful or resentful. We're just reclaiming a part of ourselves that was being taken away. And I think that's what decolonization is. And I think, you know, people who are non-Indigenous, when they think about decolonization, they're like, oh my God, the Indians are going to take over Canada. It's not that. It's decolonizing is allowing us to, not allowing us, but giving us the space that allows us to be who we originally were, who we want to be, who our people were, how we were in the beginning and before colonization. And that's indigenizing spaces too, is like kind of modernizing decolonization, is adding flair, adding Indigenous perspective. My one friend uses a term, walking in two worlds. I think that's what he calls it, walking in two worlds, a moccasin on one side and a regular shoe on the other side, and bouncing that out. And I think that's a lot of our young people are still doing that right now. They're, you know, practicing their traditional ways, but also going to university and being in an institution that was not designed for us to be. Like, we were never meant to be in that kind of space. And here we are. That's indigenizing. Us just being there in that classroom, that's decolonizing that space. Like, we were never meant to be in those chairs, but there we are, getting degrees, becoming lawyers, becoming doctors, you know, being politicians. Like, we are indigenizing Canada, one person at a time. And you know, once one of us make it, all of us make it, because it's breaking those glass ceilings, and we open doors and don't close it behind us, because more people are going to be coming behind us. So that's my answer.
I love that. That's such a great answer, and that's definitely when you had said that, like, you're still learning, you just automatically made me think of the seven grandfather teachings, and how we have to carry humility with us too, because no one ever knows everything. Like, everyone is still experiencing their own life, their own individual perspective on this gift that creator gave to us, and figuring out what that means for our spirit. So having the humility to be like, yeah, I don't have all the answers, but this is what I do know, and this is what I can share. That was beautiful. So Chimigwich for sharing, Nikki. Gabby, would you care to go into your speech on decolonizing and indigenizing?
Yeah, for sure. For me, like decolonizing wellness, I think is really rooted in land back. So we need to have access to our lands and we need to have ownership over our lands as well. These lands were stolen from us in very violent ways, and we need to see justice. It's like a big open wound. And so, how can any of us really heal or be well if we have this big open wound that's never really been addressed? So then like that kind of like speaks to education too, and Canadians need to understand their own history. That's like one of my biggest, like, not a pet peeve because it's more than a pet peeve, but one of my biggest like the one of the things that drives me crazy really is that Canadians don't even know their own history. Like Canadians believe that they just like appeared here, and then Canada's been here forever. Like Canada's 154 years old. This world is millions of years old. Canada is just a fetus. So that's like a part of wellness for Indigenous folks, is that we need to see justice. We need these things to be addressed. We saw how Canada reacted to the finding of the unmarked graves, and I think that it was good. I think that there was a lot of good in it. But we need Canadians to stop waiting until there's a report or an investigation or a committee for Canadians to start believing us. And the same is true for the health and wellness industry. They do not believe us that land is beneficial to your well-being. A lot of people actually feel that that's like a make-believe story, but I've witnessed it with my own eyes. I've witnessed it myself when I connect to the land and the water, how much better I feel. And like it's an all around feeling. It's not just like, oh, my muscles are stronger today. It's wow, I feel better emotionally and mentally and spiritually and physically. There's just something about being able to harvest your own food, to grow your own food, to trap, to fish, to hunt, and then being able to know how to butcher your meat and cut your meat and cook your meat, because that's like a whole part of health and wellness that we don't really talk about, is how a lot of young people don't really know how to cook anymore. And that's really scary. But a part of health and wellness to me is that independence. So if you understand how to do some of these things, you're more independent, and to me you're closer to being free, freeing yourself from these colonial systems that teach us that we have to be dependent on them, but we don't. And that's kind of what Nikki was talking about too, is just doing it, just going out there and taking back our lands is so important. But on the flip side, that means we have to protect and defend the land and the water. And that's where I find we're meeting a lot of confrontation with settlers and Canadians. Everywhere I go, any piece of land, there's someone trying to develop it. Any plot of land I go to, and it's just like, I can't even remember who mentioned it. I think I might have seen it on Twitter or something, but someone was saying, like we need a moratorium on development. People just need to chill, like stop making condos that no one's living in. Like let's just chill, slow down, and catch our breath. Because there's some really powerful people that will stop at nothing. They don't care if they're killing the land or the water or the animals or even us, just so that they can hoard some more money. It's really like a sickness. And that's what I feel that we're always confronting. And that's what we have to do in order to maintain our health and wellness, is we have to fight for it. And it shouldn't have to be like that, you know, and that's the justice I want to see. I want to see an acknowledgement of the pain and the trauma that our people have experienced. And I want to see support for our health and wellness, how we define it, how we determine it. So yeah, that's decolonization and indigenizing all in the same, because they have to work together. It can't be one without the other. So miigwech, hi.
Miigwech for everything. I I know I'm learning so much from the two of you, and there's so many points being raised that I think a lot of people need to take a moment to like reflect on, because even being like, even for myself, like I know a lot of everything is overstimulating. Like a lot of what being Indian means is having to be like fighting all these different battles that are being pushed towards us. um, and going back to the Indian Act, and going back to settlers in Canada as a system. Yeah, Canada is not, Canada is a not, it's a philosophy, it's a theory. um like there's no way to mark something, to own, or like to truly own land, because at the end of the day, at the end of our lives, we're going to be 6 feet buried in Mother Earth. So that's why I often find humor, like I often laugh at white settlers, that when they claim about land and owning this and that, and I'm like, you talk real brave, so you seem real tough, as if you could handle Mother Earth's tsunamis or earthquakes or natural disasters that will that are coming because of the exploitations of her resources, and that's including our bodies. And when I think about um land back, uh little fun quirky story. um I have these jeans. I always I like to put land back on the back pocket of my jeans, just because my no misogynists will be looking at me, and if they're going to be looking at my butt for free, it's going to be through a lesson. There's going to be a lesson there. And one time I was working, and I'm a barista, or was my last day. It's coming soon. I'm so close to freedom, sort of. But alas, it was some white man, of course, and he was saying he was Acadian, and he was like, "Oh, when you get your land back, does that mean I get mine back too?" And I was like, "Sir, repeat that sentence again." And he was like, "Huh?" I was like, "Did it make any sense to you?" Because it did not to me. Here's your coffee. Have a good day. And it's funny because a lot of there's so much, um like when people talk about these debates that are just basic human rights, there's a history of white settlers and um colonialists making, literally just making bad points for their debate, for their argument. Like, when I think about vegans, like the white vegans that claim um veganism is against like animal cruelty, I'm like, you're one to talk mad all this stuff about, as if your ancestors weren't eating Black people. Like, what? No. No, don't talk about animal cruelty with me. And even then, like, I'll admit, for myself, I am vegetarian, like for sustainability in terms of the just the industry that meat production has came to in terms of farming, like factory farms, and how much emission that costs us, and how much that really takes a toll on Mother Earth. But of course, like I will gladly eat a bowl of moose stew from my community, and like know that it was ethically sourced, because to be Indigenous is to not do anything in vain. I think it's to do it's to live life in a good way, to and I like to call the seven grandfathers my little personal Indian manifesto, because when we look at respect, humility, and love, and courage and truth, it connects everything together, and it gives every point of your life a blueprint to live in a good way. Um, so I think those are all valid points for what decolonizing and re-indigenizing means, because it is symbiotic. It goes together, the same way we live with the land. Um, so Chimigwich for sharing that with me, and on to the next question. Uh, I know that a lot of these topics are heavy and loaded, and a lot of people at home might be quite overwhelmed and overstimulated at this point. But what are ways that you could suggest for them to decolonize their practices of wellness, and in ways that they could ensure that those health and wellnesses systems are actually giving back to Indigenous women and women of color. Um, so uh, I'm gonna go mute, and I will. I'm hoping someone will unmute right away. 3,
2. I'm just gonna go because like to keep going back and forth. But yeah, Celine, it's okay. Like you can like just tell us. I prefer it that way because then like we'll just be like chilling. So don't worry about like just like being direct. But yeah, like some things I think about like decolonizing, like wellness practices, like whenever we talk about wellness, like I feel like the first thing people think about is yoga, and I might make some people mad with this, and I don't mean to. But to me, like yoga is a really gentrified wellness practice, and it comes from Indian folks. It doesn't come. It was never created by white folks, but it's been highly gentrified by white folks, and then many other folks also, adopted and adapted. But I'm really critical about yoga itself because of that, and just the simple fact that, like if you even looked into India's history with settlers, you would see that their history is very similar to ours as well. And then to understand like how yoga was actually maintained through colonization, as a best practice, as like a place of hope, and then all of a sudden it was just came to like North America and it was gentrified, and now like people just associate yoga with like Starbucks lattes and Uggs, and that to me is like really frustrating and is cultural appropriation. And we see it with our own Indigenous cultures, and it's so hurtful when wellness practices that have been developed by Indigenous and Black folks are gentrified and turned into, you know, almost like jokes or like really like just hobbies. And so I even think about like this whole self-care movement, you know, and to me, like self-care was created by Black women, and it was radical self-care. Self-care wasn't really talking about, you know, like taking a day off work or like going to the spa. That wasn't what self-care initially started as. It was like talking about how to take care of a community together and how to take care of each other in community, not as individuals. And that's really what self-care to me is kind of turning into. It's really about individuality, and that scares me because individuality goes hand in hand with consumerism and capitalism. And that to me and my relatives and Indigenous folks that I know, these have not been beneficial social models for us. And so reclaiming and decolonizing our wellness, to me, has a lot to do with reconnecting to the original territories that you live on. So every territory that you live on, every Indigenous territory on these lands had some form of games, sports, community gatherings, dances, songs, like seasonal activities. And I can tell you, and Nikki could probably tell you too, that picking berries might sound like all fun and games, but it's actually really hard. It takes a lot out of you. Like we seen some blueberries on the side of the road, and so we started picking them. We were maybe out there for an hour, and there was 3 of us, and like this is all we got. And you know, we almost got sunstroke. We're like sweating. Like it's hard work gathering food for your community. So I really encourage folks to, when you think about wellness, think about how it's gonna benefit you, but also your community. You know, there's a lot of folks that have able bodies that are able to give back to community. And I really like encourage you to find those things, whether it's berry picking, medicine picking, even hunting, gardening, like that's like a whole other type of work that is underestimated. A lot of folks just think it's like old ladies doing gardening, but that will get your that'll get your blood flowing too. And learn those sports and those games. Ask for permission if you're not from that territory. But like in Mohawk territory, lacrosse is like a really, really popular sport, and like people are so proud of lacrosse, and there's even allies that join lacrosse teams, and it becomes like almost like an intertribal type of sport. And you know, histories are told and ceremonies involved, and to me that's what decolonizing wellness looks like real wellness. That's what it looks like. So miigwech, hi.
Thanks, Gabby. That was great. I can't wait to hear from you, Nikki. So the floor is all yours.
What was the question again? Sorry.
Oh yeah, of course. It was basically like, how can individuals decolonize like their practice of wellness? Like what are some suggestions that you might be able to give someone, for people that are tuning in, that might not know how to best start that path?
So I think I have a message for both those that are wanting to learn and also those that are knowledge keepers. I feel like it will take definitely both parties to be able to do that together. You know, I'm not shaming anybody. I might piss some people off by saying this, but I feel like you know, nowadays our culture is also whole, and our teachings and traditions are held at a commodity sometimes. And sometimes, I'm not saying everybody does this, but some people who have that knowledge about how to pick berries, how to hunt, what ceremonies to do, the language, it's like they don't want to share those teachings unless they're getting something in return. And I feel like that's just not fair. So I feel like if you have a student coming along, that you have to humble yourself and remember where you started from as a teacher, or as a, like where you started from, and now you have all this knowledge, and who gave you that knowledge is by giving it back. And so it's like, I feel like that's a way of doing it. But yeah, as a newbie who's wanting to first start somewhere, I think you just start with where you're at and what that looks like for you. I've had some conversations about, I'm very fortunate and very, very privileged to live in my community, my home traditional homelands, like where my people come from, you know, like we have our story of how we became the people, like trout people, and my teachers here, like our Coyote Skelett was our teacher, and I'm so, like, as a kid I used to be like, I hate the res, but now I love the res. Like I love being on the res, I love being at home, I love being around my people. And you know, that's one thing I feel like another stereotype that needs to be broken is that our kids have to get off the res to be successful. You know, that's something that's not true. And I'm one of, like, a living proof that I lived on the res, and I made it to the UN. You know, like, we have to stop feeding that narrative of the res is a bad place, because it's not a bad place. It's, you know, it's a place where, you know, it was initially a place where our people were forced to be in, and we weren't allowed to leave unless we had permission. But we made it a place where it's a safe haven for us, and this is home, and it's our land, and this is, you know, where we can hunt and gather and fish, and we know the spots that were told to us. They weren't written down, they were orally passed down. And so those are the things that, you know, if somebody wants to decolonize wellness, is by sitting with somebody and just having these kinds of conversations with them. And it's not something that you can learn in a day or learn in a week. It's something that, you know, it's a lifetime. It's definitely a part of your life. And as you can see in this conversation, wellness is very interconnected. It's just not about, like Gab said, about individuality. It's like, your wellness is also connected to your community, your family, your kids. Like, I have 2 kids, you know, and if one of my kids, like, God forbid, were to not be healthy or not be well, that would make me not well. And so we, like, those interconnections are definitely important. And I can give an example of that. Like, my community is, like, my res is where we found the original unmarked graves, the 215. And immediately, our community needed that, you know, we needed to gather. Like, immediately we felt that. But we were still under COVID. In BC, we were under really strict rules, under the COVID rules. And Bonnie Henry was really upset with us, because we had thousands of people going to the residential school in Kamloops here. And we had a ceremony because we treated it like a funeral. We found 215 bodies. And so we immediately light a fire, and we immediately start preparing food to feed our guests that were coming. And I was in charge of that, to feed the people. And I was told to start off with feeding 20 people per meal. And within that 4-day ceremony, I probably fed 15,000 people. I had people coming from all over, not only, like, my community, but I sat down with people who flew in from Calgary to pay their respects. I've had, you know, survivors drive in 6 hours to go sit by the fire and be in the community. So what the example was of that was, you know, our community was hurting, and immediately we gather. And that was my wellness. I felt like, you know, I was hurting, I was mourning, you know, like we have these little ones here and these are our ancestors and we're all mourning. And what was the best way that I knew how to heal and let go, and was to be around my community and be around my people. So we did that. And regardless of what Bonnie Henry said, regardless of the COVID rules, regardless, like there was thousands of people there. And at first it was like, you know, like kind of anxiety. I'm like, oh my God, COVID. But during that whole week, not one person got COVID. And I was like, oh, Creator's looking out for us, because he knew that we needed to gather and we needed to be there together. And so from that month on, since May, since the recovery of the 215 plus in our community, that's one thing that has been constantly said, because our community was one to gather every month, whether it was for our elders gathered every month for lunch, our community gathered once every 2 months for a community dinner. So like COVID took that away. So we're reclaiming those spaces now, and we're going to be doing that and gathering together and eating and sharing a meal together. And yeah, that's what wellness is, decolonizing. I totally went off topic. I don't know if I answered your question, but
I clicked stop video instead of unmute. Well, that was great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I know that like with more bodies being found, because there is already so many lives lost that were documented, in terms of like understanding the statistics of how 1 in every 25 wasn't gonna make it in terms of like life, and how that somehow is comparable to a war. Like that wasn't like a war involves two fighting parties, but there was nothing that we could have done in terms of the fight we already have been doing by simply living and existing as Indigenous people. So I think that's sort of crazy to think of how dystopian that comparison truly is. Now, so many good points were being made, and I'm just really happy that I was asked to moderate this, because like there's so many thoughts going through my head, and I'm definitely learning a lot. Now we talk about like these spaces for us, like wellness is reclaiming land and just being in the community, and you know, practicing self-care through just unconditional love for others, including yourself. But there are barriers to each. So I think that's what we'll dive into now. But to think about the barriers, like wellness spaces, like creating barriers, specifically within these spaces. Okay. Yeah. So I know 8:30 is coming soon. But yeah, barriers, if any suggestions on how to amplify Indigenous voices to do better. And yeah, I'll Nikki, are you good for time? Okay, I'll just toss it over to Gabby first, because I know that she has to leave at 8:30, but go for it.
Celine, could you repeat the question?
yeah, so to repeat the question, it's how do like wellness spaces create barriers for Indigenous women and women of color, and sort of what could they do better, and what could they do better to amplify Indigenous voices in health and wellness spaces?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we talked a lot about the barriers. Like I think it really just has to go down, like it goes down to like who are these wellness and health practices created by and for? And like it just goes down to that we're just not we're just not European bodies that these things are created for, and so we're not going to fit into them. And so what happens is, because we don't fit into those boxes, is that we're continuously experiencing oppression and assimilation. And so I really want people to understand that residential schools are not just a thing of the past. And so we're still experiencing oppression and assimilation. They've just taken on different forms and names. So it's almost like it rebranded itself. So residential schools really turned into child welfare that, like I work with so many young people that are what I would call like incarcerated in group homes and foster care. And it's really, really scary. Like we can't even do anything about it. We just have to be there to support them through this trauma that they're experiencing. Um, but I also think of like, when I think of like health and wellness, just like all the experiences that I've had at the doctors, that people have told me about at the doctors, at the dentist. Like anytime you go anywhere, there's always some really gross situation that happens, and then to the extreme, like we've also witnessed, where literally people are denied a right to live. So like those are the barriers. It's really quite overwhelming and frustrating. And I think some of the ways that we can get through the barriers, is we need people to really care. We need people to actually care about our well-being. So instead of looking at us as like an other, people need to start looking at us as just as valuable and honorable to live on these lands as they think they are. Another part of like breaking down those barriers is folks really addressing the privileges that they have. And so one thing I really believe is that almost like the more privilege you have, the less resourceful you become, and like the less aware you become of your surroundings. And it's really quite interesting to watch some folks that have a lot of privilege not even know who's around them, what's happening around them, not even needing to like look over their shoulder. But people really need to address their privileges and break down their privileges, because that becomes a huge barrier as well. And with privilege is, when you have privilege, you don't even realize you have the privilege. And so that creates a lot of those barriers too. So those are like super broad, but it's like, yeah, all of these challenges are so huge. But it really involves all of us doing something different.
Thank you for sharing. And I know that 8:30 is coming quite soon, so if you ever have to like leave whenever during the Zoom, Just thank you so much for sharing all this wisdom you have to offer, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to participate in this conversation. Such unique way.
Yeah, maybe I'll just jump off so I don't interrupt Nikki, but I just wanted to mention that there's like the whole time we were like chatting, there's like a little spider that's been crawling on my laptop. And it's actually been like making a web around me.
That's so funny.
So I thought that was really cool. I was like,
You'll have to take a picture of it and put it on your story.
it's like so tiny, like it's like I don't even know where it went now, but anyways, I thought that was really cool. And you know, it really like talks about like what we're doing here is like building webs and connections with each other and sharing best practices. And that's the things that we need to do in order to create a better future. But yeah, so thanks so much. It was great hearing from you, Nikki, and chatting with you, and Beatrice. Thanks so much for inviting me. And hey, Anna, I've seen you there. And Selena, it was really awesome to see you moderate your first panel.
Thank you.
So see you later, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Miigwech, hi.
Great. Okay. I would love to hear more from you, Nikki, on how um, those barriers play a role in what suggestions could be done to prevent that from continuously preventing Indigenous women and women of color to healthy um, and accessible wellness spaces, and sort of suggestions to amplify our voices and our needs.
I kind of mentioned that in the beginning. I answered that about accessibility, and when I am in spaces where I'm a socialist too. I'm very like, oh my God, like I think about those people that aren't here and like that should be here. I'm always thinking about those people because I don't want to leave anybody behind. That's always been my motive in life, is to include more people, to create more space. And when I started my advocacy work, my mom used to tell me, she's like, oh, you're the voice. And I've heard that a lot, like, oh, you're the voice for the youth, or you're the voice for the women, you're the voice for the people. And I was like, no, like they all have their own voice. And I don't want to take anybody's voice away. If anything, I know what it's like to have my own voice taken away, where I can't sit and voice what my needs are, how I feel. Like I want people to be able to do that themselves, and they have it like the right to do that themselves. So when I think about barriers in wellness in general, it's the stereotypes attached to women of color, attached to Indigenous women. Those are probably the number one barriers that that are linked to stigmatism and shame when, you know, women of color or Indigenous women want to access wellness. And I immediately think of the opioid crisis here in Canada. And in 2020, we had more individuals, humans, people die from the opioid crisis than we did from COVID. And that was in BC. Our stats were way higher of people dying from opioid crisis than it was from those that were dying from COVID. And that crisis, the opioid crisis, was an epidemic before COVID was an epidemic. But yet there's so much stigmatism attached to that, that those individuals feel that shame, that stigmatism to even access the wellness that is there to help them, and that is there for them to use. I lost my sister in December 2020 from a drug overdose. She was only 28 years old. And we didn't know it was that bad, but it was, you know, when I think about those numbers of those people that, you know, lost their lives to the opioid crisis, they kind of died in silence, forgotten, because this COVID epidemic, oh my God, so these numbers are so high. And I, like, you know, my love is with their family, but yet we have a huge portion of individuals who passed away, who lost their lives to the opioid crisis and the stigmatism attached to that. And you think about those numbers, majority of those people were Indigenous people that lost their lives to the opioid crisis. And the shame and stigmatism attached to their addiction, to their life, they didn't want to access those services, maybe, you know, like I will never know why my sister didn't reach out to me, but you know, a part of me feels like she was ashamed, and I would never shame her with that. But the society has attached these, you know, stereotypes and stigmatisms that she felt like she couldn't even come talk to her older sister and ask for help or ask for guidance, or, you know, those kinds of like things that were barriers for her. And unfortunately, you know, she lost her life. So one of those, you know, those barriers are, you know, so sad to say, have been barriers right from day one. The stereotypes, the stigmatisms have carried on and are still very much alive, you know. And we see that in, you know, when you go access wellness, I'm sometimes the only Indigenous person in the gym, you know, or the only Indigenous person at an organic health food store. Like, I recognize that privilege, that I'm able to have the income to go to a healthy grocery store to access that service, but I'm far too often the only Indigenous colored skin in that grocery store utilizing it, and everyone else is non-Indigenous or, you know, settlers. So I think we have to start there before we start anywhere else, is breaking down those stereotypes and those stigmatisms.
For sure. Also, thank you so much for sharing. I know what it's like to lose family members and loved ones to this crisis. So my condolences, and Chimigwich for sharing that. I think about the stigmas and how these stereotypes do end up killing people. And going back to Jordan's principle of where this idea of money and who's going to pay ends up in that person's and the biggest cost of all of their life that they could have. There's no possibility to know anymore. So a little background to I had mentioned I was in social work before for school, but I actually dropped out to donate my liver to my aunt, and she's healthy and well. So luckily the operation went well, but when I faced so much racism. We faced so much racism when we were going through that operation, and those little hoops that they wanted us to jump through to get my aunt a second chance of a healthy life. And my aunt had never liver, like everyone associates liver with like functioning, like alcohol, and that is a really huge factor to the liver, but it's so much more than an organ to sort that out, because like we didn't have alcohol like pre-colonial times. Like we were healthy, and we found sources of happiness through community and our practices that were taken away from us now that we're reclaiming it. But it has left such an impact on us, in ways that other people will never understand or know until there is education. I was 18 when I did it, but they but like because I'm Indigenous, and I'm looking at the camera quality. I'm like, I'm brown, I swear. But the amount of doctors, like the whole BMI thing, it's like, you're obese, and I was like, okay, cool, but I'm healthy enough to donate a liver, so like I don't understand the issue. And on top of that, like, they were like, oh, are you sure you want to donate that organ? Like, you might need it. Like, you might need it. I'm like, whoa, I'm good. I'm good. I like left, like, I have resources that I'm very privileged to, in the sense that like there are ways to develop a healthy relationship with these substances, because too often, too many times, these substances do end up becoming coping mechanisms for a lot of Indigenous people and people of color. And but if white people do it, they could create a whole Instagram page dedicated to it, as for fun, for fun and giggles, without facing any repercussions of that stigma, of those opinionated, passive aggressive, and somewhat just straight up aggressive opinions and thoughts towards us, for simply doing what everyone's doing, especially here in Western society. um yeah so I think what to sum up what you guys have shared is that educating people on these systems is the first step to unstigmatize these bad associations that are taboo for so many people, to step away from that, to see the bigger picture, to see the individual, to see them as a human being, is the first step. Because often, too many times, like Black, Indigenous, people of color are seen as something disposable, or seen as another statistic or another number, instead of a life that had so much potential, or has so much potential to do whatever. But it's within those systems where, we lose out on what could have been. And so thank you for sharing. I guess we could go a little back and forth about, we talked about cultural appropriation, and especially thinking about, I mean, so my family's out in BC, too. So, sup, cuz. But it's, I know that there's been a huge rise of a lot of, like, white settlers, or just non-Indigenous settlers, that continue to, like, be like, oh, look at me, go hike. Ooh, with my Patagonia, like, I'm gonna go through these trails, but not understanding what these trails, like, what territories these are on. Like, or the fact that on Fairy Creek there's so much old growth that's being stripped away from Mother Earth so aggressively and violently, um, and how, like, yes, you might have fun doing these outdoor activities, but these outdoor activities are a privilege because it's something that was stripped away from so many Indigenous people, and not even just like it's everywhere. It's not just here in Canada, but it's for where people go visit these these resorts and go on their vacations and to exploit the Indigenous lands to wherever they want to go on their little spring break. Like these are exploited lands and like also exploited people for labor. So I think cultural appropriation is something a lot bigger than people realize. Um, I know my first interaction with um, dealing with cultural appropriation was when I was like 12. I was like, I think I was 12 or 13. But I was like in grade 7, and it was like Halloween, and the grade 12s were dressed up as like cowboys and Indians. So seeing those practices be used as a costume is something that runs rampant in every Indigenous cultures everywhere. So I'm just kind of curious on how do you see cultural appropriation and how it affects um, yourself and your community, but just the Indigenous people as well, and ways we could pinpoint and point out what that looks like what cultural appropriation is.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's really interesting that you point out the hiking, because that's something I've been wanting to do, just to reconnect on the land and be out on the land and, explore, Turtle Island and be a guest in someone else's other nation. And I was, looking on Instagram and seeing, these influencers that were hiking in BC, beautiful BC, and they, part of me, gives them a clap, because they don't disclose their information on where they're hiking, because they don't want people to go there, because they have such a huge following, that they don't say, oh, this is where I'm hiking, because they don't want people to go there. They don't want it to have like this influx of people just showing up to these amazing places. But at the same time, I'm like, that's where we can include indigenizing their experience. And, that makes me want to just message them and be like, this is the traditional territory, and this is what it's traditionally called. And, drop some wisdom on them, and maybe they can start acknowledging that aspect of the areas that they're hiking on. Because when we think about cultural appropriation, we often just think about symbolic things like, sage, or, seeing like our regalia being used as a costume, and that it, so disrespectful. But there's other things of cultural appropriation, and land is one of the biggest things. And how people like just hiking is, and provincial parks is like another thing, camping there and exploring BC, and not really acknowledging what it was before colonization. And so when I was berry picking at a provincial park here, we were picking for hushum, which is soap berry. We make juice out of it, and we can it and concentrate it, and it's a medicine. And it's like a Gatorade. It could be like a Gatorade. It has lots of electrolytes and vitamin C in it, and we can it and use it throughout the year. So we're at this provincial park, and this settler came up to me, and she's like, "Oh, you're picking soap berries," because I'm in the lake washing them out. And it's like, "Yeah, we are." She's like, "Do you know what the traditional name of this lake is?" And I was just like kind of shook. I was like, "What?" Like, I would never have thought she would have asked me what the traditional name was first. And then I was like, "I don't even know the traditional name of this lake." I was like, "But I can help you find out what we called this lake before." And because it was clearly renamed and everything like that. But that to me just made me think about the hiking experience and how it would be nice to even, some of our people have concerns with land acknowledgements, that it has to go far beyond that. But if we're starting at land acknowledgements, that's a start at getting our land back, being like, this is what it was called, this is who occupied it, this is who took care of it, most importantly. And yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think that I think that re-education is the only path to actual reconciliation. And I know there's so many people that are tired of hearing that name be thrown around, because it's been so many years where politicians were saying that they were putting in that work towards that goal, but we have yet to reap the seeds never sown. But I think that there is some hope in terms of people wanting to learn and wanting to do better. And I think that there's also far more allies in terms of like within people, like within our own communities as people of color, understanding that a lot of our issues that we face are at an intersection, that our issues are interchangeable with one another because they're one and the same. So I just want to thank you for sharing all of your wisdom and everything that you've shared with us is something that I know personally I will go and place it in my everyday life. So I want to say thank you for gifting that. And I know that we're kind of past time. So should I think we covered all the questions in terms of our panel discussions, but I think lastly, maybe just if you want to say what you would hope for wellness to look like for the future, because I think for me personally, I think about how I'm the first generation not to be in residential schools. Like it's been one generation where we haven't been in that system, but like Gabby said, it's just the same thing, different font. And I have been in the child welfare system in and out growing up. So I'm like, am I really first gen if it's the same thing? But I know for me, and I imagine for yourself having two kids, like I plan on having kids in the future, and I think my biggest hopes and fears is just to come at a point in time where my children won't have to waste their youth on fighting for their rights. Because I think that for so many generations now, our youth have been stripped away of so much innocence and so much wonder that that we see in children today. And we see a lot of youth have to grow up a lot faster because of these systems as a form of survival. So I know for the way that I know that wellness culture will, like, I know it's successful is when youth can be youth, when children won't have to worry about their mother going missing or they're being taken away from their home or all these things, because that's where these systems start, and it's within the child. And I think that's why, and I know that's why Johnny MacDonald wrote To Kill the Indian Within the Child, because he knew that if we were given the opportunity to simply be ourselves within our brownness, within our Indianness, or whatever that they want to put on us, that we would see the true potential that we could give to community. So I think that's the only way that I can differentiate success in the future. It's when that is seen, not in my generation, but the youngest one there. So what, on to you.
So what I would like to see for, re-indigenizing wellness in the future is not to only see it, working on one specific thing to fix all of you, that it is more complex than that, and that, if when you talk about re-indigenizing wellness, it's not like wellness as it is in mainstream media is by looking a certain way and eating a certain way and doing certain things. Re-indigenizing wellness is balancing things and doing those things together in harmony. And so that's what I'm hopeful for and hope to see in the future too, because when that is done, then our youth won't have to worry about that and can be our youth, and you're right, you made a really good point on how our young people, I was even an example of that. Our young people have stepped into roles that our parents were in and our grandparents were in just advocating and fighting for, things like basic clean drinking water, fighting for, human rights so that we could go to the store without feeling like we're going to be kidnapped and murdered, things like that. Raising our children and not being in fear that they're going to be taken away. Like we've stepped into those roles advocating for that. And, my kids have also stepped into those roles. Like we're not even there yet. My kids go to marches with me. My kids sit in meetings with me to witness this. And hopefully when I have grandchildren that, they don't have to do that kind of work. They don't have to be fighters, that they could be resilient and successful and thriving and healthy and happy and loved, Indigenous people in this world where they are, without being their authentic selves, without questioning it, without questioning whether they could drink the water in their sink or from their tap, or, go out hunting on the land without being ridiculed, or go to the grocery store without, being racially profiled. Like those are the things that I hope for in the future. And when we talk about re-indigenizing wellness.
I love that. I love that so much. Thank you. I think I'm gonna hand it back to the host.
Perfect. I'm really bad with technology. So thank you so much. It was a very informative session. I feel like I've learned a lot. The one thing that's sort of sticking with me, it's like what Gabby said, it's like self-care is very much individualistic. It's not the collective thing. And I'm just thinking about my own experience. And oftentimes when it's self-care, I'm just like, it's me. And it just made me think like, it's a very wrong way of looking at self-care. And it's very much to be the community thing and less so about like the individual thing. So that's definitely going to be sitting with me for a while. So yeah, so thank you so much for also being so vulnerable with us and just sharing your personal experience. And I feel like even though we didn't have a lot of people here, like having access to it afterwards is going to help a lot of people. And yeah, so thank you so much. And Celine, thank you for moderating the discussion and also being very much active in it. I really do appreciate that. So we didn't have any questions submitted. So yeah, I guess if you guys don't have any last thing to say, I'll just end it here and just want to thank you again for taking the time to have this discussion.
Thanks. I'm good here too. So thank you so much. You guys are probably tired. It's late.
I'm just happy it went well. To be honest, I think I did better knowing that there was like less participants.
Yeah.
Here, yeah. But obviously, if people are watching this and do have questions, I mean, DMs are there.
Yeah.
And also there's quite a lot of resources available. So I think that ensuring that you follow platforms like yourself of like a woman of color Remake Wellness and along with A7G and other Indigenous activists like ourselves to know what information is out there. I think that's my last advice.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much. And I'll end it here. Have a beautiful rest of the week and end of the weekend.
Language.
All right. Bye.